was in London, a man came up to me in his shop and said, "Aren't you up from the country?" I said, "Yes." He said, "You know, what I never can understand is what you people do in the country." I thought, well, 25 years of talking about the country, 300 hours of country film, 500,000 words, he can't have been listening. But he said, "Well, suppose I came down and stopped with you for the weekend. What would we do?" I said, "Well, we might go on a pub crawl." He said, "How many pubs?" I said, 3. He said, "Only 3?" I said, "Yes, they're not very close together, and anyway, we'll be travelling behind horses." When I was young, this was the only way you could move a party of people from one place to another. This is how the cricket team used to travel from one village to another. This is how my mother used to go off on Sunday school outings, behind a pair of horses. Because in those days, it would have been a wagonette, a very nice vehicle which is very difficult to get hold of nowadays, and very expensive. We haven't got one of those. What we've got is a cart we built ourselves. We call it the digger wagon because it was copied from an Australian design. It's a flat wagon with seats on it and rubber wheels, and the seats have got a hollow arch underneath, so you can load anything you want on it. You can load half a dozen fencing rails or anything else, but at the same time it's perfectly good for carrying a lot of people. And where we live, we can do this just about with the same feeling as we did it when I was tiny, because this is countryside which is not got caught up in the great transport of the country. About 10 miles to the south there's a road which travels westward with a lot of traffic on it, and about 10 miles to the north there's another road that travels westward, the two great roads, but in between the countryside belongs to the farms and to the wild animals. As you notice as you go along in this journey, you won't see much of modernity. There's just the edge of the town, the only town we've got within reasonable distance of where we live, and that's pretty tiny, and we only go there once a week for shopping anyway. And the roads behind, there are no concrete edges to the roads, there are no white lines in the middle of the roads, there are no cat's eyes, there are hardly any traffic signs at all, and the whole thing is full up with people just getting on with the business of farming. This is how you get to know the countryside, of course, travelling at this pace. Driving about in a motor car is the worst possible way of knowing the countryside. You don't see anything. I've put people on this wagon and driven them down a road they know, and they end up knowing more about the countryside on that bit of road from one little trip down it behind the ponies than they would do by driving down it 100 times. For one thing, you don't have to drive. Once the horses get going nicely, they'll do most of their own steering themselves, and you can look over the hedges, and because you're much higher up than you are in a car, you can see a lot more over the hedges. In fact, life was spoiled for my father when the car came, and he couldn't stand up in the pony trap and look and see how other people had got on with their hedge cutting or whatever it might be. When you come into the villages, they themselves are pretty quiet. They're particularly quiet today because it's just about the end of church time on Sunday. And here is the Royal Oak. Very good draft cider at the Royal Oak, extremely good bread and cheese, and a skittle alley in which people have paid skittles for hundreds and hundreds of years. We haven't got time to take you in, I'm afraid, but we'll be on our way. But that's the first stop, and I wonder whether my town friend would be bored by now. Remarkably unspoilt village this. Most of the houses unaltered in the main from a long time ago. They're all pretty well equipped inside, and most of them with modern kitchens and so on. You can see we put up a little hill here, and beyond it on the left you can see the chalk hills themselves, because this was once the seashore. Once upon a time the chalk hills rose up out of this and surrounded this piece of country, leaving a bog in between, and then the sea broke in at the Bristol Channel and filled it again, and it lapped up against the chalk hills. They were once the seashore, and along the edge of these chalk hills there's a seam of shingle all the way along, which used to be the beaches. In the meanwhile, in the middle, it's just clay all the way, and because it's very, very hard stuff to cultivate and needs very clever farmers to grow crops on it, it's largely still grass. And the fields here are 7 acres, 10 acres, 6 acres, 12 acres, and yet in the adjoining county of Hampshire you could hardly see a field as small as this anywhere in the whole county, because the great farming is taken over. By the time you've driven this road a few times in the summer, you know where every bird's nest is. And by the time you've lived here, hello, there's a deer, you see. Deer standing grazing perfectly peacefully in this field, just looks up to look at our digger wagon, and then puts his head down as soon as we've driven on, and none of us interfere with him. And now we know we're coming to the next pub, because this fellow always trots out from the farmyard to run along behind the cart as we pull into the car park of the Crown at the next village. Extremely good draught strong ale, the Crown. I wonder if my urban friend would still be with us at this point, or whether he'd want to stay in the Crown till closing time. It's a pity if he wasn't, because from now on I think the whole place gets even more beautiful. These undulating lanes, you see, even the Vale, it looks as flat as a football field from a distance, but it has its little undulations, and over them go these lanes that have been trodden by driven horses ever since the time of the Anglo-Saxons. Those of you who like the books of Thomas Hardy may remember the first 2 or 3 pages of The Woodlanders, where the carrier's cart is being driven by the old lady bringing the barber from the town, who's going to cut off the poor girl's hair in order to use it for doing up rich ladies' hairdos. These are the very lanes down which this cart was travelling when that was written. It seems as you go along like an absolutely unchanging place, but the fact of the matter is it is dramatically changed within the memory of quite young people. That's a surprising thing about the English countryside. If you were to have been born and brought up in this vale and gone away, say, to Canada in the early years of the war, and come back just, say, 7 or 8 years ago to visit your friends, you really wouldn't have recognized the place that you were brought up in. And the reason for this is one tiny little creature, a beetle. The beetle that causes Dutch elm disease, because the whole of this was covered with the classic English elms, 7-8 foot apart in all these hedges, the traditional background of English cricket. And then in a drought year, with a great hatching of the beetle, the whole lot was killed. And for a decade or so, this was a vale full of tree skeletons standing everywhere. still a few small skeletons that haven't yet reached the wood pile. Of course, if you cut an elm live with a sap in it, it's a very sulky burner. But when they're killed by the Dutch elm beetles and they die on their feet and the sap runs out of them, they're absolutely splendid firewood. And that beetle has kept the fires of the Vale burning ever since, and it's also changed the appearance at all. Jeff, who was born here, he's the one who's driving the cart at the moment, he says that you wouldn't recognise this Vale from what it was like 20 years ago. And yet, in a sense, it's a sort of benefit, because it's revealed the oaks, the old oaks that grew in the original clay bog here before the Saxons came to cut them down, and allowed them to show themselves again. And they look magnificent, and the views are wider. Everything changes here. You see, that fine old farmhouse wasn't a farmhouse, it was actually the coach house of one of the big estates nearby, but now the big estate house has been pulled down and the old coach house has been converted to a farmhouse alongside the old church and indeed the old monk's fish pond. Many of the farmhouses are, of course, just the same as they were in the Hardy days and in the days before the Beetle. Many of the surnames have been unaltered in them for a long, long time. The Vale has changed its whole look, and yet it looks so beautiful. It shows how difficult the philosophy of conservation is, because if anybody had offered to cut down those elms, there would have been the most frightful row. And yet, look how the oaks look now, where they haven't got the elms to compete with them. The truth of the matter is, of course, that the countryside will change itself surprisingly often in the course of history and in the history of man and the countryside together, and yet, given time, in each phase, it will always make itself beautiful again. And now the horses settled to their easy trot, a sort of hypnotic trot that makes you just want to sit behind them quietly. See how the oak tree stands out now, where once you wouldn't have been able to see it. And see the chalk hills rising behind. Those have changed too, of course. People value the famous downland turf and fight hard for its preservation, and yet originally it wasn't there at all. It only came into existence through the sheep. It was when men brought the sheep to these downs that the famous mixture of herbs and the downland turf developed. Prior to that, they were just masses of thorn bushes on the tops there. We're climbing over the edge of one now in order to drop down to the next place we want to go to. Past places up there which have the name Thorn in their names often. There's set thorns and thick thorns, and there were battles fought up there by people like King Alfred which had names, usually like the Battle of the Thorn Tree. So that in itself is something quite man-made. As are these villages just up on the shoulders of the chalk hills, where the snow drifts in the winter and they very easily get cut off. That's just about the slope that horses can tackle at a trot. Not more than 1 in 30, they used to say in the coaching days, when they built the turnpikes road to suit them. And they love to be driven in pairs. A horse is a herd animal, and they seem to be twice as happy, more than twice as happy. And they go twice as easily, and they seem to tire half as much when they're driven in pairs. And they go so nicely, it looks as if Jeff isn't driving them at all. But of course, there's never a moment when horses shouldn't be driven, even when the driver is talking to somebody else or looking half asleep. His hands are alive and still driving, and he's keeping his horses together and making sure that one horse doesn't slack and make the other one do the work. It's a gentle art, but it's a continuous and very skillful one. And we're coming down now off the shoulder of the chalk to a place where the changes in the district, or typical changes of any English country district, can be seen. Because here is a place that has changed 3 times. The Abbey, it's called. And on the right of that row of buildings, the Abbey still stands, built in the days when the church was competing with the barons for temporal power. And then after the church fell, the Abbey remained, and an aristocrat came, one of the new aristocrats who were born in every generation of English life, and he built a great aristocratic mansion alongside it. Not only did he build it, but he moved the village, the medieval village, because he thought it was in his way, and put a lake in its place. And he lived there for his very short span of grandeur. And then most of those sort of estates passed away, and it became, as these things have so often, a public school. Down under that hill, alongside the Abbey and alongside the great mansion, are the football fields and so on. Extremely lovely place to be sent away to school, I must say. And now we turn at the bottom and we come to the village that was built in the place of the ones that he moved. And he had it built by that greatest of all the landscape gardeners, Capability Brown. He said, build me a village, and he built that one. It all came off, unlike any other English village, all of which grew by accident and by the lives of men affecting them. This came off the drawing board of one of the great designers of 200 years ago, and he designed not only the cottages but the post office and the store and the pub. And the pub's a very fine one, and because so many people come here in the summer and buy so many postcards of the village, it serves the most excellent food, which we will now have. Turn ourselves round to the Hambro Arms. When that old village was knocked down and the new one was built by Capability Brown, it sounds like a sort of dream idea of a man who wanted to improve the place and make it look better. Actually, it was done with all the ruthlessness of those days. The people had absolutely no choice as to whether they moved out of their cottages. They were his cottages, and he was going to put them where he liked. And they were moved as soon as Capability Brown had the new village ready and told where they were to move to. And they dug up absolutely everything when they made that lake in its place, including the churchyard. And the workmen, it said, were very embarrassed digging up the churchyard. And they said to his lordship, "What are we going to do with the bones?" And he said, "Well, chuck them on the fields and plough them in. They'll do a lot of good." So that's the background to a village which is now the subject of so many postcards. We have a very good lunch there, and we'll turn away, and then we start to climb, because up from the Abbey village we can find a slow route which will take us gently up to the top of the chalk hills. Very other few places where we would care to bring a pair of ponies up with a load, but here they can do it, and it takes a long afternoon with the autumn mist beginning to spread across the vale to bring us along the top again, back by the high road to where we started, with the most wonderful view. This view is quite staggering, and right at the top of it a man built himself a little farmhouse. Because he built it there, they called it the Folly, and indeed he did have lots of troubles. He had tanks built underneath it in which he tried to pump up enough water in the winter to last him through the summer. He suffered the wind and the drifting snow in the winter, and finally went away, and somebody came along and made it into a tea house. And it really is, without doubt, the most magnificently placed tea house in the whole of Wessex. And after the long afternoon, to digest the meal we had at the third pub, we can now call in here and have cream tea to finish the trip at what is undoubtedly the most spectacular tea house in Dorset. Because as I walk along here and look out in the rising mist of autumn, you can see every place we've been before. In fact, earlier in the day when it was clear, you can see across here, right across the Blackford Vale, Hardy's Dale, Vale of the Little Dairies, right into the Sparkford Vale, and on to see the Mendip Hills and the Quantock Hills beyond. And swinging my eyes to the right, I can look down on the house I live in. Well, there it is. Only 3 pubs, and in fact a surprisingly short journey. One's so accustomed now to going 35 miles to a cocktail party, or 50 miles just to lunch with somebody somewhere by motor car, that you don't realise the time it took to get to Place in Horses. That journey took us from church, the time the churches start in the morning, until the time that the mist was coming in the evening, and the total of that journey was 17 miles. Every bit of it was beautiful, and every bit of it was interesting. So that's the sort of thing we do in the country. I wonder if a townsman would find it interesting. If you do, perhaps if you come down there, I might meet you in a pub where they have a table skittles board. So I'd better do me practice. Cheerio.